You're listening to In Sickness, a podcast about caregiving with Allison Breininger and Justin Bima.
Good morning.
Good morning.
How's it going, Justin?
You know, it's going kind of the same as it has been. Nothing real big going on, just kind of plugging away through winter and, yes, staying the course.
Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
In a good way, in a sad way,
No, in a good way. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, we'll take it.
Yeah, for sure.
I long for the day when my update is just like in my life, it's just like boring, like nothing, just boring. When people are like, I'm bored, I'm like, cool.
Yeah.
Why don't you complain about that a little bit more? Because I would love to be bored. So I'm not saying you're bored, but you know what I mean? Like
I get that.
I'm glad that it's just like, yeah, same, regular, cool. So I'm happy for you in that.
Thank you.
Because there's a joy in that I think we caregivers understand that others maybe don't.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
How about you? How's life going over there?
I think medical stuff I'm just not even going to get into today.
Yeah. Fine.
So it is complicated, but I'm just not going to go to that part of my brain today.
Yeah. Well, there's more when I ask how you're doing. How are you doing?
That's
it's
true.
not just how is Sean and the medical side doing.
You know what?
Like,
good point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're more than just that.
What? Good reminder. Thank you, friend. Yes.
You're welcome.
I'm feeling a little swirly.
Okay.
And so I'm glad that I think our conversation today will help me unswirl that a little bit.
Right.
Just because stuff with negative space is busy and it's exciting and there's just so much going on in the world. And I think that as people are starting to really figure out like, oh, caregivers. Yeah, they're a thing. Maybe we should do something about that. I'm just on a bunch of different committees and groups and stuff like that of people who are trying to figure this out.
Yeah.
And which feels really exciting and also just packs my brain full of all the things. And so, and it's interesting that I see sometimes different patterns emerge, whether that's either from like meetings or from what I'm seeing on social media. That's sort of like I see trends that are like, everybody's talking about this thing this week. So this week, what I noticed is that a lot of people are talking about caregiver training.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is training for like you or me, right? Not for paid caregivers, for us unofficial, family, untrained caregivers. And so I was part of a couple of different groups this week that were sort of pushing for that because there's this thing that's coming down through Medicare, Medicaid that is actually going to be for the dementia population. But I think they're trying out the model in hopes that at some point it will be for everybody in caregiving. Okay. It's called the GUIDE program. Okay. It's an acronym. And it's going to provide for family caregivers access to 24/7 caregiver navigator, $2,500 in respite care.
Oh, wow.
And access to free caregiver training.
Great.
Yeah. So they're trying this. Don't quote me on this, but I feel like they said they're going to try it for like 8 years or something. I hope that they see if it works sooner than that and then add the rest of us in sooner. But so what's happening is that then more providers are thinking about like, oh, this is something that I might be able to provide to the caregivers of my patients. Right. So this training topic has been coming up a lot. And so I've been thinking about that, about how like so many of us, you and me included, like we don't have any medical background. We come into this thing and we end up doing really technical, often high stakes medical tasks. Right. And decision making and things like that we are often not trained at all or trained really quickly. And then off we go and we're expected to do these things. Yeah. And I think that as like hospital stays are getting shorter, there's more and more being expected of us all the time. For sure. Yeah. Because they're trying to get people out of the hospital and back home, which sounds great on paper. But then what does that leave us with? That leaves us with more tasks. Yep. Right. For which we are not trained. Yep. So that's what I would love to talk about today. Let's do it. Is like kind of what our experiences have been with that. And also like, what do we wish for? Yeah. Right. Like what would be nice to have. So when I say all that, like what's your experience in, have you received any training? Did you wish you had all that? Yeah. What jumps out when we talk about training here is, so I don't even know how many years ago this was where Sarah started getting infusions for her POTS, right?
And it started with, she had a IV in her arm, and we would do it that way. And, it took a long time to get a bag of fluid through there. And every like 3 days, the nurse had to come to replace it. It wasn't like and it wasn't working well there. So we went with, she got a central line, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a little more involved hooking that up and dealing with that than just the IV on the arm.
Can you pause and just sort of say to folks like where a central line is located and all that?
Yeah. So a central line is like on your chest, and it is a tube that goes into your aorta, I think, and then basically right. into your heart. So it is a tube right into your heart.
Yep.
Which feels like kind of terrifying.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So as far as the care for that and the process of doing the infusions, and she did banana bags, which is like you get a liter of fluid and then you have these little vials, and you're taking a syringe and you're extracting the fluid from there and putting it into the bag and shaking it up. And, the whole time you're making sure everything is like wiped down with alcohol pads and like to keep everything clean.
Now, pause. You said this is you, Justin, doing those things that you just mentioned.
Yes.
In your house.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So from the training aspect, so she had a nurse come once a week to change the dressing. There's a bandage that goes over the central line to keep it clean. That gets changed once a week. And so it must have been right after she got back from getting the central line in. Shortly after that, the nurse came out to kind of walk her through the whole process. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And, maybe this happened, maybe some of this was before when she was in her arm too. So it's so long ago, it's a little shaky. But I wasn't there when the nurse was there to explain it all. For whatever reason, I must have had to be at work or something. So what happened is Sarah took a video on her phone of the nurse explaining it. And that was my training.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And the nurse counted that? Like, you got to think the nurse had to like check off a box somewhere that says, I trained the caregiver.
Maybe.
I mean, clearly she did count it because she left.
She trained Sarah in a way, but it's also kind of awkward to do all that work yourself and hook it up.
Right.
So, yeah, I guess that counted if that's a box that had to get checked. So I watched that, and, over the course of, years of doing that, I got more comfortable with it, but it's still always, I was never like 100% comfortable with it because it just felt risky. It felt high stakes. And it was like, and there's like, you have to make sure there's the tube running from the bag of fluid into the tube that goes into your heart.
Yeah.
And making sure that there's no air bubbles in there.
Right.
That could be real bad. So like, it feels like I can't mess this up, or something real bad could happen here. So yeah, that felt like a lot. And yeah, I think in retrospect, it's hard for me to imagine why I wasn't there. But there must have been a good reason. But that would have been really helpful to be there to be able to ask questions.
Right.
But even then, just a 10-minute walkthrough and okay, you're off. Right. Even if I had been there, that would have felt like, wow, that's here we go.
Right. Well, because you think about teaching, right?
Yeah.
Like that's not a good training model, because there's no hands-on.
Right.
You didn't get to actually do it and have someone giving you feedback and say like, is this right? Is this right? You know what I mean? It's different, obviously, to like watch it on a screen than to do it yourself.
Right.
And the translation of that is tricky.
I did have the benefit of like, I could go back to the video, which was helpful.
True. That's a good point.
But yeah, it wasn't, I never felt well trained for it.
Yeah.
And then something similar to that, or related to the central line stuff is, Sarah is every week seeing them change the dressing. Right. And, it's not always the same nurse. And this is, for years this happened. And so she became an expert on like, this is how it works best to put it on me.
Yeah.
These are the products that work. These don't work for me, because they, sterilize the whole area and do iodine and different things. And so sometimes she would kind of tell the nurse like, okay, no, do it this way, do it this way, do it this way, which is kind of wild. But she became very aware of how that dressing gets changed. And there were a couple instances where, it was coming loose and like maybe the nurse was coming the next day, but we needed to get it like down and sealed up, before for that 24 hours or something. And so a couple times, and also like there was a 24-hour line we could call to have someone come out. But if it's like in the middle of the night or like 10 p.m., like that just feels like a lot.
Right.
And so Sarah walked me through the whole process, like of changing that.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, kind of getting your on the job training from the person who had it. And that was very nerve wracking. Because there it's like the tube going into the skin, like that's right there, and you got to make sure to get everything clean around it, and you don't want to get infected or anything like that. And so, that whole experience, I felt untrained throughout the whole thing. I guess I got pretty good at it, but it always felt high stakes and like on edge a little bit through the whole thing, all the years that we did that.
Is there anything that you think would have helped? Right. Obviously, if you had been in the room, right. There, but like otherwise, is there anything that could have made you feel more comfortable and confident in that?
Yeah, I think having some sort of, and maybe this is just how I take in information, but having like a written guide, especially with a like, for lack of a better word term, like troubleshooting section.
Sure.
Because also sometimes the machine wouldn't like be working right, or, there'd be and we'd have to kind of like, we didn't have a manual for the machine. And like, not that we wanted to get in and like tweak settings or anything, but just like, here's an error. What does that mean? What do we have to do? Things like that. That would have been a helpful.
Yeah. So there's nothing written.
We didn't have any written
oh my goodness
stuff. Yeah.
Well, the other thing I keep thinking about is like our houses are not sterile environments.
Yeah.
And so that's a whole thing and you have animals, I have animals, like, it's, and so that to me, that has felt like a thing as well. Is like, oh my gosh, like not in just day to day, but like when you're doing those things and then, here comes a cat walking across the table or whatever. And you're like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. And so, Sarah was getting her dressing changed once, and somehow I would always have Mosey. We got Mosey sometime during the process of her having this line. Yeah. And like Mosey got out of the room that I was keeping her in and like jumped up on the bed and like, broke the sterile field. And that was a whole mess. They just start over from scratch.
Start over. Right. Yeah. So I think there's that piece too. Yeah. Is like, am I sterile enough? Like, that we just don't, like, we're not in like a hospital setting where they are set up for these things and they have all the equipment. And do we have the gloves? And do we have the blah, blah, blah,
Well, and just basic training in like getting things sterile. What is important, like the order of operations, just in general, that kind of broad thing. Yeah. That's another gap.
Because I remember, so Sean has done, has a G tube now and has had one off and on for years. And that they talked about how like, think about the G tube almost like a fork, right? Like it goes into your gut. Yeah. And so when you think about like how sterile all of that needs to be, it's different. It's not going into your bloodstream. Right. It's going into your stomach. And so just like as a fork, is going to go into your mouth and that's going to go into the stomach, right? Okay. That it's sort of like the level of concern about contaminants or whatever is different there than when it has been when it goes into an IV or in a port, right? Right. And I was like, okay, that's helpful. And not that we're like flopping it around everywhere, but you know what I mean? It's just sort of like, okay, how high are the stakes? Like, what? Yeah. And so we've had similar where he's had PICC line, he's had ports, he's had all of those different things. And like we've had things where he had to have IV antibiotics, and again, it was the kind of thing where they were like, he can stay in the hospital and get these like every 12 hours, or you could go home. And I'm like, well, let's go home. Yeah. But then it's like, oh crap. So then that means I am now doing this thing. And so I remember with that one that like, like within an hour of us getting home from that hospitalization, like a guy was at the door with a training kit, like with a, like, okay, here I am. And they had this thing that I loved as an educator it was like a laminated like placemat that had pictures of the different syringes.
Oh, wow.
In color.
Right.
And it would be like you and like pictures of the like the alcohol wipes and everything.
Yeah.
And you would lay the actual items on the placemat because that was the order in which you did the things.
That's genius.
It is genius. And so easy and reusable and whatever. And so like when you said you didn't have anything written, right?
Yeah.
Like this was this perfect visual. And even if I was not like, even if English was not my first language or whatever, like so easy. And I would literally put it down and I would put my items on the thing. And then I would just walk through it and do it in order. And it was like, oh, you know, so that part of that I thought was like a genius move.
Yeah. And with something like that, I mean, if as caregivers, sometimes we're doing training for people who are coming in to care for our person while we're off doing other stuff. And to have a tool like that when we're the trainer,
oh my gosh,
which is a whole wild other piece of this.
It is.
I can see that being incredibly helpful.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so I thought that was a very slick thing. But again, like you talked about, like it was still really high stakes because of things like you said, like the bubble, like you can't have any bubbles. So if the bubble goes into their bloodstream, you know, like what?
Yeah.
I remember when he had his bone marrow transplant, he was in the hospital for 38 days.
Yeah.
And I remember that my mom and I got taken off to do this like training. So we were in like there was like a little training room. And I remember that there were like dummies, mannequins, whatever.
Okay. Yeah.
And I keep trying to remember like what it was that it was a port. I think it was a port, but like that she and I got this little training course. But I mean, I think about the state I was in at that moment.
Yeah.
38 days in the hospital. And that we were like, okay, we're going to leave. And we're leaving soon. And then, and then we're learning this really hard thing. And I was grateful that my mom was in town and that's before she lived here, but she was in town helping us. And so it was two sets of ears and eyes together.
That's what I was going to say. Like that's to be able to not be the only one getting that and to have someone else go through that with you, know what's going on.
Yes.
Like that's fantastic that you were both able to do that.
Exactly.
They were able to do that for both of you. Yeah.
Yes. And that I'm fortunate that I had another person,
True. Yeah. Even that. Yeah.
Yeah. But I remember it was this little training, like almost classroom that they took us to in the hospital and that we got to like practice, like squirting the things and cleaning up, you know what I mean? Like on a dummy. And which I think was helpful. I mean, also like I remember just like referring back over and over again. But I think that about that piece that often the training comes like at discharge time when our brains are like, like, okay, we're going to leave. And what time is it? And we're going home and I'm just tired because we've been here. And now you're going to teach me this new information.
Right.
So I'm thinking too about like what you said about the video, that was not necessarily planned, but how helpful it was that then later you could rewatch it, So yeah, that was a big one. So I think I've been trained to do like the port stuff and the feeding tube stuff and the IV antibiotics. Yeah, I think as far as like those acute tasks. So I think there's a couple buckets. Like one is like the acute tasks that we do.
Yeah.
And I think I don't think that this has been the case for either of us at this point, but like I know that for a lot of people, when they have to do like transfers, like moving their person from a space to a space, it's one thing if you do that once, but if that's something you're doing multiple times, it's really important both for your body and their body that you're doing that, in the best way. Yeah. And so I know that that's a huge thing that some people get training on, or like if you get to a point where you're giving your person, they're called the ADLs, activities of daily living, things like bathing and, like it's maybe not super intuitive to like, how do I, bathe my mother with dementia who's bigger than me, you know what I mean? Like as an example kind of thing. And so I think there's those types of things as well that people might just assume like, oh, you just go give her a bath, but like, no, like how? Yeah. Right. So I think that's a whole extra bucket that I think maybe you and I haven't yet experienced. Right. But that many of our caregiver friends have. Yeah.
Yeah. I think another area of training that would be helpful to a lot of caregivers is navigating the paperwork, the insurance, the billing, all of that piece, if there are government programs you're taking advantage of, like navigating those, like that's a whole bureaucracy and like expertise in knowing where to get the forms, what are the right forms, who to call, is what they're telling you, does it make sense? Like,
right.
Or are they not really, when you're dealing with insurance, like, does that make sense what they're saying?
Right.
That's a whole piece where we have to sometimes become experts in that and do that on our own without anyone to kind of hold our hand through that. And I don't know, there may be places that have some amount of training or resources available to help people through that. But that certainly wasn't the case for us. And I could see that being a real help and easing some stress for a lot of caregivers.
So here's kind of the catch-22 of this, right? Is that we caregivers are, I think I can say this globally, tired, busy.
Yeah.
We don't have a lot of extra time and energy in our lives. So if you saw an ad that said, and maybe this is like years ago, right? Because you have kind of become an expert now, but which you had to do on your own. But maybe this is in the beginning, and it said, "Hey, here's a 1-hour class on how to navigate the paperwork of being a caregiver."
Right.
Do you think you would have taken the class?
I think more likely than not, if it was an easy, like if it wasn't, I didn't have to drive very far. If it, there would have to be a certain amount of convenience. If it was too inconvenient, there's a barrier there. But I think something like that I would have done to kind of get some more information, to feel like it wasn't just me trying to like wade through this all on my own.
Yeah. Right. Because I think that there are, and even I sent you something the other day that I had heard because I was in this meeting where they were like, Washington State is the leader.
Yeah.
And I was like, really? That's where Justin lives. And you were like, I don't know if this existed back then, but I would have used it. And so, I wonder like, you didn't know that existed, and that's your state.
Yeah.
And so part of it is like, what's out there that we don't know about, I think that sometimes what I have experienced is that I think that our practitioners feel like, oh, that Allison, she's got her stuff together. And so I don't think they think to refer me to places.
Right.
Even stuff like palliative that we had to like find on our own. And things like social workers, they've never been like, you should have a social worker. And it's sort of like, hey, tell me what's out there.
Do you think that those are they know the doctor
Good
doing the
point.
procedure, or the doctor, you're talking to, are they getting training on what
Great point
to recommend for resources? Probably not.
No.
Yeah.
No. And actually I'm on this whole committee in Minnesota that's trying to do this better, because I think they're seeing that there are programs.
Yeah.
And then they're seeing caregivers aren't using the programs, and they're trying to figure out like, what's the disconnect?
Yeah.
And who is it that can tell the caregivers about the programs, and who will caregivers listen to? Because that's the other thing too. I'm sure I've been handed brochures over the years.
Yeah.
But like, oh, you're handing me a brochure. What is this?
Yeah.
And so how is it like accessible to me? And am I going to call and then I'm going to be on hold, or am I going to this, or what do I even ask? And so how can we both make sure that there are resources and training available that are like accessible? Like you said, there's low barriers, like you don't have to drive far. Maybe it's online, or maybe it's free.
Yeah.
But also, how do I find out about that?
Yep.
And I think about our friends who have not yet claimed the title caregiver. They don't even know to like Google. So if you don't think you're a caregiver yet, you might not Google, right? Caregiver training or paperwork.
Yeah.
Because you're not using that word yet. And then that kind of stops you from being able to like access it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a tricky thing. And I get the sense you probably know better than me, but like, there are places that are providing some amount of training, but it's certainly not broad. Right. I mean, you sent me a study, and this was like cancer centers. And I think like, what was it? Like maybe 25% or something like that had some amount of like medical nursing type task training that they offered, which is not a lot.
No. And I would bet that's like kind of like what I got. Like, okay, take her into the room and teach her how to do that thing, which to me feels wild. Like, what are the other 75% doing? They're not doing that at all? What?
Yeah. And what I mean, I briefly went through that, reading about that study, and the biggest reason for the places offering this training was because it was requested by like the caregivers. Like it was because caregivers like, hey, can you provide something to help us with this? It wasn't the forethought of like, hey, we should put this in place.
Right.
It was like, and on the one hand, that's like, okay, I can advocate and maybe make a change here.
Yeah.
But also like it's on us again.
Why?
We had to push for it. Like, yeah.
It always comes back to us.
I know.
Dang it. That's why, I mean, I'm on these committees that are trying to like make change, right? And so like this one I was talking about before would come down through Medicare. And so like the provider would be like, oh, if I want this chunk of money from the Center for Medicare, Medicaid Services, I need to provide these things to caregivers.
Right.
Right. And I suppose, fine, if that's what's going to get you to do it, great.
Yeah.
You know, it's rarely out of the goodness of their heart.
Yeah.
Like, this is a thing. You know, and I will also say, like, I have a contract with IanaCare, our app that we love so much. And because a big thing they do is support employers so that the employees get benefits as who are caregivers. And one of the benefits is that I provide 2 trainings a month on caregiving. And so all these people, employees who come work at these agencies, you know, that work with IanaCare, then have access to come to 2 live trainings a month.
Oh, wow.
And so, I mean, that's another way to do it, right? Is through employers who realize that like, oh, if I support the caregivers who work here, maybe they'll be happier and work better and stay, you know? So, I mean, that's another model. Yeah. And there we talk about, I think a bucket we haven't covered yet is things like all the decision making, right? Yeah. About like especially for elder care, thinking about, do I put my person in a long-term care facility? Like, what does that look like when we're thinking about dementia? Like, how do I, or aging family members, like, how do I keep them safe? And what are the signs I should be watching for? And so, you know, there's so many decisions, you know, like in our last one, we talked a lot about hospitalization and even making those decisions about, do we go to the ER? Do I call 911? Do I, you know, like, those are things that we are doing without being trained. Yeah. So there's these acute decisions like, okay, I see the symptom. What do I do? Like we're triaging constantly. And there's also these like big picture decisions we're doing about like when to stop treatment or when to move them into another space or when, you know what I mean? And so again, like without training, I think that's like just wild. I think it
exponentially probably increases the amount of stress and
oh my gosh,
like physical mental toll that it takes on you.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I've been doing posts in the last week about our last episode. Yeah. And they've been just like, people are really engaging with these posts about hospitalizations and just about all the decisions they need to make and around hospitalization. And and I think another piece is thinking about that. Sometimes I was thinking this when you said the thing about Sarah becoming an expert on her own dressing change.
Yeah, right.
So sort of sometimes the flip side of this is that even though we're not trained, that sometimes we do become the experts. Right. And so I know that there have been some programs where caregivers have to, like we had a listener who said she cares for her adult child and they like had to go through some training. The parents did. It was a requirement. Right. And she was like, I could teach this training. Right. Yeah. And so I think that's a flip side of it is like, in some ways we want more training. And in other ways, we're like, we are the experts. Right. Because we are the ones doing it every day. And so, you know, that's a little, I don't know, there's a balance there that like we want to offer it to caregivers so they can fill in the gaps of the spaces where they don't feel like they have the support, but we don't want to require it because in some ways they know more than the experts do. Yeah.
Another piece that I'm thinking about is there is some training available now. We would like there to be a lot more training available. Yep. Caregivers have a lot on their plate. They're exhausted. Yeah. They don't have the capacity or whatever to like do a lot of research to find out what is out there that is available for me to feel more trained, feel more resourced. So like, how do you bridge that gap? Like, is there a third thing that is like a resource person that you can have to be like, hey, I'm struggling with this. Is there training available? And they can like, they know everything,
right?
Or know where to find the answers to that.
Yeah.
That you can then get without you having to do the work, or like, hey, I have questions about this. And they're like, oh, here's a webinar that has information on that. And I don't know how that happens, how that gets funded or whatever, but that seems like that it could be a very important piece to make this
absolutely
really nice for caregivers.
Yeah. Because even I think it was when I was looking at your Washington State one, there were lots of links to trainings.
Yeah, right.
There.
I was looking at that when you sent me that, and I was like, oh, wow. Huh. I didn't know about that.
Who knew? Right.
Yeah, that could have been helpful.
Right. Exactly. So I think you're right that I think that like caregiver navigators, when those exist, are amazing. And that's part of this guide program that's coming down. Is that you would have access to a caregiver navigator. I think that then like at like patient navigators, like people at cancer centers or wherever, social workers. I think a hard thing is that those are often I'm seeing the first positions to be cut.
Right.
Yeah. So like back in the day, we had a patient navigator that we loved, and then through American Cancer Society, and then they got rid of all of them. So yeah, I mean, that's a person who like their job is to like know all these things. And so, but then what if that doesn't exist? Or again, that requires, in what the scenario you brought up, is the caregiver asking for what they need.
Yeah.
And guess what? We are not good at that.
That's true.
If I'm in the cancer center that day, I'm not thinking like, oh, hey, I mean, I might be because I'm, this is what I think about. But most people are they're like, what do I need for my person?
Yeah.
And they're likely not going to like spend time or energy or seek out someone to say like, I need something too, because they might not even realize it exists.
Yeah.
So my dream, and there are a couple people who are doing this, but not as well as we wish, is that, in the cancer space or in any big diagnosis space, that there would be a kind of thing where like appointment 1, here comes the diagnosis, caregiver gets their own appointment.
Right.
And in that appointment, there's someone who's just focused on them. And part of that is, here are the ways that we can help you.
Yep.
And then throughout the diagnosis and the treatment and the survivorship, that continues to happen.
Right.
Because if I'm in the room with the patient, that's where my brain is. And even if they like slide a brochure towards me, I'm like, no, I'm not. I can't. Nope. What? Right. And so, but I think if I'm in the room by myself and they're focused on me, and they say, did you know we have these resources? I might be more likely. But again, just like I keep thinking about like binders we've gotten over the years and whatever, like if it's just a list of websites, like, I don't know.
Yeah. Right. It needs to be a little more specific than that. Yeah.
Right. Right.
I think too, like you mentioned, having your own appointment, kind of like you feel more comfortable asking certain questions maybe when the patient is not in the room with you, because it feels out of place to ask like, okay, how can I manage this for myself? Like you're there to talk about the patient. You're not there to talk about you.
Yeah.
So I think that would be like, give permission.
Yes.
To be more, because, training is not just how do I do these tasks to take care of the person I'm caring for. There's training around, how do I balance this with everything else in my life? How do I watch for signs that like I'm not doing well in this? I think the study you sent called it like caregiver distress screening or something like that.
Yeah.
So there's things that we could be better trained on to keep an eye on us.
Yeah,
for sure. If we could go back for a minute, when you mentioned that you had this patient navigator and then they cut all that.
Yep.
How did that feel?
Oh,
like, gross. I can't imagine like to have, because I imagine that was a very helpful resource. I don't know that it was perfect. I don't, but to have someone who's there to help you walk through this.
Yep.
Yeah.
It felt gross.
Right.
It felt so gross because it felt like cutting the humanity out of it. Right. Like, because she was the one that would like see us as people. Right.
Yeah.
And she didn't have like, oh, I can only hang out with you for, 23 minutes and then the appointment's over. Like, or she was the one that like you said, we need a person who knows all these things. Like she had an office wall full of all the brochures, and was like, oh, you know what would be good for you? This one. you know?
Yeah.
And I remember her saying, like, if you fill out this thing, you can get like a grant for a gift card. I was like, I don't even have it in me to fill out the form. And she's like, how about I will fill out the form and you just sign it?
Great.
I was like, great. Thank you.
Love it.
You know? And she also was the person, she helped people with like wigs, you know, and all of that. And so, yeah, it just felt like, really? Like, you don't see the humanity in this. You don't see the need for the, and I'm not saying they didn't see the need because, you know, money, whatever, but it just felt gross.
Yeah.
And sad.
When it feels like decisions are being made based on like numbers on a spreadsheet.
Oh, for
and you're
sure.
not based on you as a person, the people that are like you said taking the humanity out of it, I think is like, a really succinct way to put that. Yeah.
Yep. For sure. Yeah.
Oof.
I want to say for a second, because somebody the other day commented and said she is a nurse. So she's caregiver for her husband.
Okay.
She is a nurse, but that sometimes it doesn't matter because it's her husband. Right. So feels like a totally different thing.
Right.
And so it kind of reminded me, you know, I used to be an early childhood expert in my past life. And when Maya first came to us and like wouldn't sleep and wouldn't whatever, I was like lost. I remember calling my other early childhood expert friends and being like, tell me what to do. And they would tell me. And then I'd be like, oh, I knew that in my brain, but I couldn't apply it. First of all, because my brain was covered in stress. Right.
Right. Yeah.
But also I just couldn't apply that thing to my own kid.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? So that's like, what this caregiver
whether
was
that's
saying.
Like compartmentalized in your brain or something. It's like, I know this in this sphere, but like this is it's a different space. Like there's different links in your brain or whatever. Yeah.
So that's what this caregiver was saying. Is like, I know the things, I'm a nurse, but when it's my husband, I can't apply, you know? And I also wonder about if at some points, like she was commenting too about the ER thing, and that sometimes if she walks into the ER and says, I'm a nurse, this is my husband, this is what he needs. Yeah. That they like listen more. But I would also be afraid if the ER team heard like, oh, the patient's wife is a nurse and he's in the room, that they'd be like, sweet, they're fine. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because I think they sometimes do that even with me, and I'm not technically a nurse, you know, but they're like, oh yeah, she's watching she'll tell us if something's going on. But I think that like sometimes that could maybe be used against you. Like just assume like, well, you don't need to be trained on this because you're a nurse. Yeah. It's like, we don't assume. Don't assume anything, you know? And I think and it kind of depends on the day. People kind of can't win, but like sometimes, you know, like let's say when Sean has like a bazillion Mohs procedures. Yeah. And they're like, do you need us to go over the things, the instructions? And sometimes I want to be like, really? Like I spend more hours here than anybody else. But other times I'm like, no, please, like don't assume. Right. Because I need to keep this fresh too. And it's high stakes, you know? So I think that's a thing, is like the not assuming that just because someone does have medical background or because they have been around all the time, that they don't need extra support and training, because that repetition is good too, you know? Yeah, it is. Yeah. Yeah. What do we think? I was going to say, are you ready to go to supporters, or do you have anything else?
Well, I was just going to say, like, okay, we've recognized that there's this big gap here. Like, as caregivers, like, what do we do? Do we just recognize there's a gap and we're like at a loss? Is there... Right. Yeah. It feels like it's I don't know, it doesn't feel good to like be in that space of like, here's this big thing that would be helpful. And, you know, I don't know. What, do you have any thoughts? Thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah, I do. So I think part of it is, and I hate to put anything on caregivers, but to say, to recognize that I think there actually is a lot of training out there. There's this one, I can't say that I've used it myself, so I'm not vetting it in that way, but I know it exists. So there's a thing, it's called Embracing Carers. And they have created a bunch of trainings that are like approved by the UN. And I think, I think that those are more like, you know, how to do an IV and how to do, you know, they're the more tactical kinds of things. So maybe one thing that we could do a little bit of is maybe in the show notes, I could send some links of like, here's the things that it doesn't matter what state you live in. That here's some trainings, right? So that's one thing, is like I can collect some of those places. Another thing I think caregivers can think about is, you know, do you have a social worker, a nurse coordinator, somebody? And can you say to them, do you know if there's any caregiver training available for me? You know, just to see, like, because possibly there is, and they just didn't think to act, to provide that.
Or even if when you're in the medical setting, asking if a patient coordinator or caregiver navigator is a thing that they have and you can take advantage of.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
And I think I think social workers or social workers,
as well. Right. Yeah.
And they're more likely to probably have those, maybe.
Yeah.
If they don't have the others. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think those are one. I think another is just to know that, like, I'm on a bunch of teams of people who are really trying to make this thing happen. So even knowing that, like, the United States government is putting this into play for our dementia caregiver friends. So if you're a caregiver whose person has dementia, look into the GUIDE program. Okay. Because that is for you. And that includes training. And so to know that, like, this is something that is being worked on and talked about, and that I'm on at least a Minnesota specific committee where we're trying to figure out how to better connect folks to resources. Another thing, I think there's this statistic I had written down about 68% of caregivers say they need additional guidance and training to do these tasks well. And I wonder if, I think yes.
Yeah.
And I think that we caregivers are really hard on ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's probably true.
And so I think about you doing that banana bag thing for years. And if part of it is that we can say, like, hey, I'm doing this really hard thing and I'm doing it well. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
I'm not saying we don't need training, but I'm saying to give ourselves credit for this really hard thing that we are doing.
Yeah.
And that might feel good too, because I'm sure that with anything, we would all probably say, well, yeah, I could do it better.
Right.
Because we're really hard on ourselves, but to be like, actually, I'm doing pretty well, so just to take that moment to acknowledge that for ourselves. The other thing I'm just thinking about is, like, if any of this would be, because like I said, I do these trainings for in contract settings. And so thinking about if maybe I should start offering them to the world, because some of these I could do, if that would be helpful. So anyway, we can keep thinking about those things, but yeah, those are a couple first thoughts.
No,
anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's a good starting point for kind of thinking about that.
Yeah. Okay.
Supporters.
Yeah.
This is a harder one, I think, for supporters to help, maybe. The one thing that comes to mind is if you are a person who, like, research and, like, navigating resources is something that you are good at.
Yeah.
Don't wait for the caregiver you're supporting to ask about, hey, can you help me figure out these resources? Look, see what your state offers, see what or wherever you are, what is offered. If there are, like, our local community college does, like, continuing or, like, adult classes, kind of like a short session things. Like, maybe there's one on, like, managing paperwork for an elderly parent, there could be, or estate planning, things like that, where training could be very helpful. That isn't necessarily medical related. But
are you saying the supporter should go to the class?
No, I'm saying, like,
tell the caregiver
supporter should, like,
look it up,
could see what's available. Like, what are all these different options? And then I think you have to be a little bit careful as far as how you relay that to the caregiver. Like, not in a sense of, like, you need to do all of this stuff.
Right.
Because that's...
Or I think to be careful to not be like, because if someone was like, you should take a class on this thing, it would make me feel like they thought I wasn't doing it well.
Right.
And I needed more training.
Yeah. But I think approaching it like, hey, recognizing what they're doing is difficult, recognize that they're working hard at it and, doing well, or keeping things going. And that, hey, if you need more resources, if you want to know about certain things that are available, I've done some legwork on that, and maybe you can say, like, and here's something maybe, or, you can use me as a resource to kind of help you find things there. Like, one, to know that someone, like, looked up, spent the time to figure out what could be helpful for you, what programs are there, like, that would mean a lot.
A lot. Yes.
And so that's one area where I think as a supporter, you could potentially help a caregiver.
I love that. Because I think when we think about supporters, we always think about these, like, really concrete, hands-on, like bringing a casserole. And I think back to our Enneagram conversation a long time ago about like, what's your skill set? Right.
Yeah.
And some people really like researching.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and they can do that regardless of where they live, and they can, you know what I mean? And so I love that. And I think always using like, I think it's better when you have sort of a triggering thing, like listening to this podcast.
Yeah.
Right. So to say like, hey, I listened to this podcast and they were talking about caregiver training and how needed it is and how people often don't know where it is. Would it be helpful I really like researching. Would it be helpful if I like did some research and saw like what's available? Like, what are some topics you would wish for? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So using this as a springboard
For sure. That'd be great.
for that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I think another thing is the acknowledgement of it. So again, to say like, I was listening to this podcast about caregivers and all the tasks they do at home. And I'm wondering like, what are some of the things that you're doing for your loved one that like none of us see, but that you're doing that like are behind the scenes, you know, like, do you want to tell me about that? Or like, what does it feel like? And do you know, just to sort of that acknowledgement piece.
Yeah. And give them a space to kind of talk about that a little bit. And
right. Right. And again, I think this conversation can be a springboard for that. Like they were talking about how like when they first did it, they didn't feel, you know, equipped at all. And I'm just wondering like, what are some of the behind the scenes? Because I think that's some of the stuff that is just wild. Like if your people at work like knew you were like mixing up vials of stuff, you know what I mean? Like it's wild, some of the stuff that we do. And that's a big part of it, is that it's behind doors. And so nobody sees it. And so just to say, you know, what are some of the things that you do for your person, you know, or just like, I bet it's amazing the things that you do and that you weren't trained for that. And that's wow. You know? So I think that acknowledgement piece is huge. Yeah.
That would be huge too.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Anything else you want to add? No,
I think that's a good conversation on training. I certainly hope that these meetings and committees that you're a part of and that I'm sure are happening elsewhere around the country and hopefully world as far as ways that this can be improved. I hope that tangible results can come out of those. I hope that in 10, 20 years, hopefully sooner maybe, caregivers will feel much more resourced when whether it's leaving the hospital or getting a new diagnosis, having more training, more tools available.
Yep.
Yeah. So thank you for the work that you're doing.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I think will make a difference.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to be doing it, and I hope that it makes a difference and can help. And I think if you are out there and you're listening and you work for or with like a health system, or even if you're just a person like listening to the news and you're hearing things like we're shortening hospital stays, to just think about like what's the result of that? You know, what does that mean for the caregiver? When we see these great headlines, you know, people are living longer with cancer.
Yep.
Great. What's that mean for the caregiver?
Yeah.
You know, so to think always about that person who's in the background in the negative space and how it impacts them as well. So, yeah. All right, friend. Good talking. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. It's always great to chat.
Yes. All right. We'll see you next time.
Okay.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. You've been listening to In Sickness. Find us online at insickness.care or on Instagram at insicknesspodcast. You can send your questions and comments to insicknesspodcast@gmail.com. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with a friend or fellow caregiver, or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening, and take care.